Today I'm joined by Sasha Farley, and we're going to be talking about productivity. We're going to talk about return to office mandates and a lot of the things that executive leadership is getting wrong when they're thinking about employee productivity, like best ways to optimize somebody's workday and how to set them up for success and to set up knowledge workers in a way where they can actually be productive in a sustainable way. So, Sasha, thanks for joining me today, and I'll just let you briefly introduce yourself, if you would.
Yeah, super happy to be here. I have my own consulting firm called Sasha Farley Consulting, super inventive name. But I basically work with companies of all sizes, helping them align the way that they work with the way that the brain works and kind of shifting some of our preconceived notions about how work can be done based on what we've experienced through most of our life and our history and what we think of as work now, into what it can be given all of the potential we have as we look forward into redesigning what work looks like. So a lot of challenging preconceived notions and really just trying to align it with the human side of it, mainly focusing on the way our brains work for what we need them to do, since that is the most human element of us, is our brains.
So what's the main thing that people misunderstand about productivity? What's the disconnect between what we think productivity is and how the brain actually works?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the times when we think about productivity, we are thinking about it in terms of how machines would be productive, right? I think even the word in and of itself, productivity, is a productization of something, which is a very industrial and machine-based thought process. And I think when we talk about people as humans, our brains are not actually machines. It's a really easy metaphor, and a lot of times neuroscientists will use a machine metaphor for how the brain works, but it is actually an organic system. And so we can't produce things and be productive in a continual basis the same way that a conveyor belt can, or the same way that a machine can. And a lot of the times it's easier to think about the way we work in those sort of metaphors. But when you think about a humans' abilities to focus, to think, to be doing something, even physically, even if we're not even talking about knowledge work, fluctuates throughout the day. You'll be extra productive and then you need a break. You can sprint for a mile, but then you're probably going to need a little bit of a break unless you're an endurance athlete. But even endurance athletes needs breaks a bunch of the time. So I think one of the challenges with work is we don't think about the breaks that are needed. And that's a really human part of the way that we work, is that we need breaks and we need to build in cycles into productivity instead of thinking of it as maximizing efficiency and trying to squeeze every little drop of something out of a person the way that you can machines or other sort of tools that we work with every day.
So why is it that our brains don't work in a way that our bodies work? Like I was thinking back to before I got into any sort of knowledge work, sitting in front of a computer, my body was able to do any number of hours. Like it could keep doing repetitive actions. But one of the things that I struggled with the most when opening up a laptop and getting paid to do it is it just stops working. And it happened to me the other day. I went on tilt for 3 hours. And then I'm like, my God, I just roadblock, brain just turned into jello and stopped working. And I'm like, I have to get away from this. Like, why is that? What happens in the brain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting part of the dynamics to think about. Our bodies are controlled by our brains. So everything that we do is controlled by our brains. But doing repetitive tasks becomes something that is habitual, that doesn't actually take that much brain power every day. And so I think we underestimate that a lot of physical jobs and a lot of physical labor is really repetitive and really reminiscent of other things that we have done throughout our life. So our brain can kind of go into an autopilot mode, which doesn't take that much time or energy because it knows it. It's just repeating something that it already knows. That's very different than a lot of knowledge work that we do when we open up a laptop and we try to engage through technology. It is usually requiring us to think in different ways, to problem solve, to take all these different ideas and put them together, which takes conscious energy and effort that then takes more energy. So our brain is a muscle. Our brain uses energy the same way our bodies do, but it's about how much effort you're putting into something. And when it's a rot habit, like runners, right? We just talked about endurance athletes a second ago. Like endurance athletes can run for a really long period of time because their body gets into this habitual rhythm that just doesn't take as much energy as me trying to run, which takes all of my time and energy because I'm not a very efficient. My muscles don't know what they're doing. They're learning it, right? It's the same way for our brain. And knowledge work, by its definition, is always creating something new and trying to create different connections, which is why sometimes it's very different to be able to tap into it, because sometimes you're just tired and sometimes your brain is just like, I'm already tapped out for whatever reason, and this is not something that I have the capacity to be focusing on at this time point.
Okay, so we've been doing knowledge work for how long now? I mean, sure, we've had writers since as long as we've had history, but I mean, in modern history, we've had knowledge work types of jobs for, I don't know, say 100 years, commonly. Why are we still treating it like this linear productivity curve and we haven't adapted to it?
Yeah, I think it's probably from how it developed into our current work today, right? So if we think all the way back to the knowledge workers of the past, right, the philosophers, the people who have created all of these wonderful ideas of what we did, if you think about where they actually did their work, there's like famous stories about Hemingway and bars and pubs and things like that, right? Like people were doing work at really odd hours, really being able to control when and where they did the work themselves historically. And then when we started to create businesses and more businesses, and the productivity of businesses was driven by knowledge work, that actually developed largely out of the industrial era, when we were talking about and structuring work around assembly lines and around how do you produce something with your body physically in factory settings and stuff like that. And the knowledge work started to grow by the managerial levels that were helping manage those floors. And then that stuff got bigger and bigger and bigger. That managerial and oversight level, which is the knowledge work, kind of started to become bigger. And then companies themselves started to become just that thing, really. And so that's kind of, but if you think about where it came from, it was based on these industrial structures and functions. And so they were just adaptations of that mindset of managing people doing these repetitive tasks as we were building and the tasks were actually changing. There were very few people who have actually thought about the differences in the type of work that we are doing, which is why the days are still structured 9 to 5, right? 9 to 5 was fought for because it was much longer than 9 to 5 back in the day when you had to be on the factory floor.
Henry Ford, right?
Yeah, people fought to get a 9 to 5 for manageable amounts of time and effort. And so we still have all of those holdovers because honestly, no one's really stopped to think about how we use our brains different than how our bodies are used. And to be fair, there honestly wasn't really a lot of data until the past 10, 20 years where we've been able to do a lot more imaging studies and there's been a lot more investment into it. So there wasn't really that much that we could really understand about how this was working in terms of what's actually going on in the brain. We just had behavioral results of it, which are very easily colored by subjective thoughts about what you think are the reasons for some of these behaviors. And so I think it's just we haven't had the chance to stop and think about it until now, when there's much more of a push to start to push back on what is this 9 to 5. COVID forced everybody to have an experience of something different. And that forced exposure at a broad scale then allowed more people to recognize that it doesn't have to be this way, that it's just an assumption that it always had to be this way because that's how it slowly developed. And then all of a sudden there's this opportunity to do something different because we all experience something completely different on a global scale at the same time point, right? And I think that's where some of the eye-opening questions started to come out.
I feel like there's still this fear from a lot of management executive levels that if you can't physically see an employee, there's a lack of trust there, right? There's always this fear that remote employees are doing chores, doing laundry. I think you actually posted something on LinkedIn about doing laundry and how there's this fear that if remote employees are not being productive at all times. And I guess there is some element of truth to that, but why is that? Why should it be okay and even encouraged that you're not just stuffed into this 9 to 5 box?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the experiences of people in leadership positions, most of their careers were probably done in person, at least the ones that are really pushing back on these sort of things. Most of their careers were really done in person. And so as they developed their careers and their experiences and their expectations about what it means to be a manager and what it means to be a leader, they were in person and they got a lot of this feedback. They got a lot of, I was really talking to someone that they were like, If I go in and all the phones are ringing, I know things are working, and it gives me a sense of safety and comfort. Like there's all of these feedbacks that come from being in person that is really instilled into our brains that shows I can trust this because this has been the cues that tell me that I am in the right place, that tell me everything is working well, that show me that things are progressing, because that's how it's always been. And so when we talk about this push for people really wanting to see people at work and leaders really want to see that, you're really getting at the concept of our brains like certainty, and our brains get used to certain things to give us a sense of certainty. So with everything else changing in the world, because work is not on its own, right? It's all within the broader context. So with everything else changing within the world, people's brains are trying to get a sense of certainty. And as a leader, that certainty that you need is you need to find a place that shows that the economic situation that my business is working in is changing completely. How do I know that people are working to help make sure that my company can be subsisting? I can't control the economic situation. I can control how and where my people work. That's the only thing that feels like within my control. How do I make sure that they're working? What have I used in the past to tell me that they are working? And it's all these in-person cues. So they're clinging to this sense of security and safety from this like instinctual fear response because of all the uncertainty. And so they're clinging back to what they're used to for what's comfortable. And it's hard because to change that, you have to change your behavior and you have to change what you're used to, and you have to challenge your literal physiological responses when you are stressed out. And that is a really hard time to learn anything, to be honest. And since none of us are having time periods where we are calm, everyone is reverting back to things that we feel safe and comfortable in. And that unfortunately happens to be in-person work, because that's the last time they can think of that things weren't so crazy. And all of their history and their careers and their brains are telling them that is what I know works.
Right,
so they're like going back to that and ignoring all the other evidence that it has been working for the past 2 or 3 years, right? Or even 5 or 6 years if we go all the way back to COVID. They're ignoring all of that because they're in a state of heightened tension, and like honestly, like fear responses are starting to take over. I'm seeing in a lot of people's decision patterns.
Yeah. I imagine it also kind of challenges everything that they believe to be true about work. And there's probably some ego attached to that. Like, well, if I'm wrong, then my last 30 years of my career could have been wrong. And I didn't need to be in the office. And maybe it wasn't important to put on the suit and tie. Maybe I wasn't an important person to come into the office. There's a bit of challenge. So I actually do want to talk a little bit more about what would go into breaking down that thought process. But before that, I want to get an understanding from you as to what you think like an ideal work setup could look like for somebody working either remote or in an office, in a way they're set up where they can be productive and their brain can recharge at the right times. They can work at their peak productivity to that specific person. And I know you wouldn't be able to create like a blanket statement of this is how you need to work, but what kind of systems could somebody put in place so that it does a better job of optimizing it for the worker, rather than just 9 to 5 come into the office?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I always say that it's best to start with really thinking about what work you want different people to be doing and your teams to be doing, because the answer is different depending on that. There is some work, right, that requires in-person time, but it's usually less than people think, especially when we talk about most typical corporate type jobs. But so trying to think about what exactly is the work that this team needs to be doing, and then how do you need to set that up? So basically, if you want to be doing strategic collaboration, big picture thinking, pie in the sky, blank wall things, there is data that shows that can sometimes be easier to do in person because we can feed off of each other's energies, and it's just a little bit easier and less draining to do that in person than it is through a computer screen. But really, how often are you actually doing that sort of work? And the work that you do is the question. Usually it's less often than you think it is and less frequently than you think it is. So if you are actually trying to do other parts of your work that's really focused, where you need to have time, where you need to sit down, you need to tease through a bunch of data, any sort of analysis, any sort of like critical thinking, any sort of actual document creations, which a lot of us have to do, anything that requires focused tasks, those need quiet time. They need a combination of focused and diffuse thinking time, which basically means quiet time where you can focus specifically without distractions, whatever that looks like for you. followed by time where you can kind of do something that doesn't take any mental energy at all. This is going for walks. This is literally doing anything that's routine or habitual, cooking, cleaning, whatever. Something that doesn't take any conscious thought. And that's the piece that pairs together when you need to be doing these focused, critical thinking, problem solving. You need to be making sense of something and transitioning it into something meaningful. That needs quiet time. Now, what does quiet time mean to different people? That's also an important element of this. So introversion and extroversion is actually really relevant when we talk about workspaces, and that's playing out a lot in terms of leadership preferences. So focused time and what environment you need to focus is very different frequently between introverts and extroverts. Extroverts, like I'm an extrovert for myself, so use this as an example. When I study things and I need to read things that I don't want to, if I go to a coffee shop and I get the background noise of it, I actually am better able to focus just because I am around other people in general. I don't want them talking to me because they're distracting me, but I want the noise around me. It actually is really helpful than sitting in a quiet room. Versus introverts tend to need a quiet room because all the talk around them can be distracting and doesn't let them focus. So what exactly conditions you need to create is where some of the variance comes from. And I think that's where some of the larger conversations are coming from in terms of who is deciding what situations are best based on their own preferences, right? And assuming that everybody else's preferences are similar to those preferences. But in a very broad sense of it, right? If you're going to be doing focused, creative thinking, problem solving, something where you need to be in your mind and using your mind, finding time where you can be in a place that allows you to focus and then taking regular breaks. If you need to be doing creative and problem solving, brainstorming, like strategic thinking where it takes people working together, really heavy collaboration, that does tend to be a little bit easier done in person. You can still do it virtually. There is plenty of ways to do it. It just tends to take learning new skills that we haven't really gotten that good at to do that well. But those can be more in person. So it's about thinking about what actually is that balance to figure out what is the right balance for the work that you want to be doing. So that means sometimes some teams need to go into the office 2 days a week and work from home 3 days a week. Sometimes people have to go into the office 4 days a week and work from home 1 day a week. Sometimes you only need to get together once a year and you're fine. It really depends on the type of work that you guys do and how frequently you really need to do a lot of like strategic thinking and those sort of things that can benefit from being in person. So it's really about thinking about it from a micro and macro level to figure out structuring the days. And then when you do need to work together and talk together, making sure that it is something that actually needs you to be talking to each other. A lot of the time we use meetings, which I call synchronous communication, to get around us being bad at writing things down clearly and being clear in our written communications. And so if you find yourself doing that, then you are just being bad in communicating in general. Like if you can't clearly communicate it in writing, saying it in a meeting is not going to address the problem. You're still going to be bad at communicating it. So it's also a balance of figuring out that communicating asynchronously, which tends to create more time for people to have focused time, and communicating synchronously. And there's like 3 other elements I introduced as well. It's so complicated because our brains are super, super complex in how we work. But that's like the places where I tend to start is those 2 elements because those are the grounding places.
Let's dig into meetings a little bit more. This is kind of an area I get a little bit excited about because I can't stand meetings. And I did see that you posted something on meetings. I don't remember the exact context of it, but I know for a fact from me, having coached teams, having been on teams, there are way too many meetings, just full stop. Everybody's got way too many meetings. And these meetings, like you've got a 15-minute before the meeting distraction, preparing for the meeting, during the meeting, that a lot of times doesn't need to happen. And folks like myself who are more on the introverted side don't do so well in those meetings. You've got a lot of, especially in person, you've got a big presence in the room that can dominate the meeting. Nothing of value could be said. And then afterwards, you've got like 15 to 30 minutes of processing. And if it's in the middle of your day, that breaks up your day. Like you could be going through this focused thinking, diffuse thinking, whatever, and then all of a sudden this albatross in the middle of your day happens that probably didn't need to happen. And God forbid you've got, one meeting here, 30 minutes later, another meeting, 30 minutes, another meeting after that. What are we doing wrong with these meetings? Why are we not? I think some companies are doing a good job of adopting a lot of async types of tools. Our company is we use WhatsApp, we use Slack, all this kind of stuff, and Loom videos, which are great. people in these more corporate, bigger companies love these meetings, and I don't know why. Help me out.
I mean, yes, we have an addiction to meetings. That is, I think, very clear across most types of business that works in offices. The reasons are multifold. I think meetings in general pretty much suck because, one, they're always formatted not very effectively. So meetings tend to not, when people hold meetings, they tend not to think about them and truly plan them out. Whoever's hosting, whoever's calling for the meeting, whoever owns the meeting, whatever you call it, isn't planning out what they want that meeting to achieve enough. They're not thinking about who needs to be in the meeting enough, and they aren't thinking about how they need to structure that conversation enough to make it beneficial. So that's where it all starts to break down. If you do plan out your meetings effectively, what ends up happening is when you start to think about what do I actually need and why am I doing this, sometimes you end up realizing I just need information from another person. That's a one-way conversation. I just need to get someone in a room because I want to ask them a question and I need them to answer it. That's not a meeting, right? That's a lot of times where people are like, you could have gotten an email and all of us could have just responded through the email and then you get the information you needed from all of us. Maybe it might take a little bit longer, but it'll be more efficient because it's all written down. And then like you said, some of the people who don't like to speak up in the meeting can give you the information. The loud voices don't get to waste 10 minutes just repeating themselves over and over and over again, and all the different tropes that we all know from meetings. You get what you need. So that's one of the main things is people don't consciously think about it. They just choose. If they need to talk to somebody else, they just assume that the best way to do that is through a meeting because it's the easiest, right? It takes the least amount of thought actually to schedule a meeting than to use any of the other tools. So honestly, it's our laziness and
right?
Our habits. It is, in a way.
But we're dancing around the fact it's a little bit lazy, right?
Yeah, it is lazy. But our brains are lazy. So it's not necessarily a contribution to a person. Our brains are lazy. Our brains like to do things with the least amount of effort. It is literally what they're designed for. If they can be more efficient in something, they will. And an efficient thing is to do a meeting because that means I don't have to do all of that thinking. It'll figure itself out, right? Well, after 30 minutes, we'll probably get what we need out of it, and it's great. It's easier. But to your point, is it's easier for the person who wanted the meeting and usually less easy for everybody else. It usually is more wasteful for everybody else who was in the meeting than the person who calls the meeting. And that's one of the times where you get into this vicious cycle, which is challenging because leaders tend to be the ones who call meetings. And the person who calls the meeting tends to think it's very beneficial, even though everybody else in the meeting tends to rate it as less beneficial than the person who calls it. And if you do that over and over and over again, the leader is getting reinforced that this is actually a really helpful way to do this process and is only getting that reinforcement mechanism besides the general statements of why do we have so many meetings. So that's part of how you get into that negative loop. And it is because our brains are really lazy. So the way to get out of that is by forcing yourself as a leader. I call every single leader, before you put any meeting on a calendar, to really write down for yourselves, what do you want to get out of it? And how are you going to get that information out of it? And is there a way that you can do that without meeting? And if the answer is yes, then just do the other way. If the answer is no, I really can't think of another way, then hold the meeting, but be conscious of who actually needs to be in the meeting. Not like, oh, well, John should be in the meeting just in case we talk about Z, he'll be there, just in case. Don't invite those people to the meeting. That's also why meetings suck, because the wrong people are invited to the meetings. But yeah, so it's multifold, but that's one of the core things that tends to why we have so many meetings and why they tend to suck.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about what it takes, because you're working with executives a lot, what it takes for these executives to kind of rewire the way that they think of a productive workday and how to manage employees. And this includes that too, meetings, right? So how would you do that? How do you get them to think of things in a different way? And what incentive would they have to do that? Because I do see a lot of busy execs, and they're going to just be lazy. They can. They've earned it. They're up there, right? Like, why would I need to do that kind of thing? So how do you convince them that they shouldn't be doing this and shouldn't be lazy?
Yeah, I think the way to start to think about how to change behavior for everybody, and this is true for executives or no matter where you are in your stage of your career, it starts with being able to be really honest with yourself about where you are and a sense of self-awareness and feedback that lets you be aware of who you are, right? Because we all perceive things through our own lens. And it's really hard to see what we are doing from other people's lenses because a lot of the times we don't get a lot of feedback. And I'd say executives in a lot of instances do not get that much feedback. The higher you get into a leadership position, the less feedback you tend to get. That's why a lot of executives actually have executive circles that they be a part of to try to have someone to talk to, because the higher up you get, the less people you have to talk to and work through things. So I think a lot of it starts with a lack of feedback. That's why a lot of times they'll bring in consultants and coaches to try to start to get that feedback. So as an executive, I think it's important to recognize and start to actively ask for feedback and listen when people might give you something that might feel like a critique. Be really open to it and really hear it and start to build that self-awareness. And then the challenge is with everybody else is once you realize something that you might want to shift, you have to start to actively put more energy into the thing to actually try something different to see what happens. And that is where the scary thing comes in. Because when we talk about executives trying something different, the risk that they are taking by doing something different is huge. And so to start to make these adjustments, it's important to be self-aware of what preconceived assumptions are you coming in with. What habits do you have that are just personal habits that you are applying to your whole company, which happens a lot. And also, what assumptions do you have that maybe should be questioned, especially since our whole world is sort of blowing up and a lot of assumptions aren't necessarily all that true anymore. And then thinking about different things that you can do starting on a small scale that might be able to adjust what you're doing. Try different things that maybe just within your leadership team for you to get comfortable with people working in different ways. Maybe allow your leadership team to work a little bit more from home, recognizing if people hear that, they're going to be pissed, but test out little bits to understand how comfortable it is and to build your comfort level before you do it. Try it with one small department. Add down within your organization to start to test it and get comfortable and do experiments. Experiments are always really great ways for you to test and try something new that feels less risky in our brains because it's not permanent. It's a temporary thing. It's a set. We put a structure around it. It's a set thing and it feels safer for us. So if you're really starting to feel like you can't make changes because it's really, really risky, which it is, I'm not going to lie, try experimenting in various ways, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Try experimenting it within your organization and then seeing and being honest with yourself about how it worked coming out of that related to what you want to be successful. And most of the things you should be looking at in terms of success is your company moving forward, and whatever that team's responsibility is it actually happening? So not how many hours are people working, not how much time you saw them working, none of that stuff. Is their projects getting done? Are their projects getting done on the timelines? Are people seeming to come up with new ideas? Are you getting to have like a better energy and excitement within the team whenever you do get to see them if they're hybrid or whatever? Like whatever sort of balances are important to you, all of those different metrics you can put into your experiment to try to measure what's working and what's not working when you do it. And that can be some of the ways to do stepping stones, to be changing some of these assumptions and testing some of them to be like, is this true? I think people are less productive at home. You probably already have data that that's not true because almost every company in existence has already tested that. So look at that actual data and be honest with yourself. I think 3 days a week is too much, or too much time working from home. I need them to do more. Do a little test, let people work 3 days and then switch it and then look at the data and really see it and trust it. Most of the time you'll see that the more flexible you give people, the more productive the output is that you get from your people. It's not always the case because, like I said, in some industries, it is actually more beneficial to be in person more frequently. It just depends on the work that you're doing and also the culture you have within your organization. So long-winded way to just say, listen when people give you feedback and try and experiment so it feels less scary for you.
So I'm curious because we're seeing all of these return to office RTO mandates being put in place. And largely, I don't know, it just could be media bias, and that's what I'm seeing, but it seems like it's larger organizations that are doing that. So what kind of companies are you seeing that are actually open to having these types of conversations with you, where they're open to questioning their long-held beliefs and checking their ego a little bit and saying, okay, I actually do want to use some sort of data to test what works better? Is there a size difference? Is there an industry? All of that kind of stuff. What's going on there?
I think the smaller the company and the more flexible they are, or more kind of experimentally they are, their work product is in general, the more open they are. Also, how tied their values are to humans. So there's B Corp is an organization that attracts a bunch of people who really care about companies that actually really care about larger well-being in general, of the sustainability of the planet, all that sort of stuff. Those sort of leaders obviously already are buying in and investing to get the B Corp certification, and they tend to be more willing to invest and understand how to best increase their human part of their organization, because they realize their people are their key aspects. I will say lots of huge organizations are doing experiments in this for people who are doing various remote work, and a lot of remote work researchers and academics are doing experiments with really big companies. Obviously, don't really say who the companies are, but a lot of research is being published in really big firms. I think the challenge is whether people are actually listening to the data and how they are choosing to interpret the data in bigger firms. And I think this is true in any time that you do an experiment. That's why I was saying you have to be honest with yourself when you are interpreting what you are seeing, because science is beautiful, but we all have examples in our heads of how people interpret data to say what they want it to say. It is very true. So it is like a really interesting thing, because those big companies who are doing return to office, they probably did a study, I guarantee you, but they probably interpreted the study in a way that was easier for them to do, because in remote work there is increased loneliness, which some people are like, well, great, see, we're doing a societal good by bringing people back in the office, because people who are back in the office report less loneliness because there's more connection because they're in the office. Yeah, they hate their commute. Everyone hates the commuting. But they hate the commute, but they're more connected. See, so we're doing something good for our people because it is better for blah, 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 blah. The challenge that I see with a lot of the experiments that are run with really big organizations, though, is that they compare hybrid to fully remote without addressing one of the problems that we are having with remote work, which is that still most people currently working remotely are using in-person practices and processes and applying them remotely, which is why you see people stuck in Zoom calls back to back to back to back. That's what we used to do in person all the time. And it is annoying when you're in person, but really hard on our brains and on our bodies when we do it virtually. There's a lot of studies about that. Talking to you through Zoom is way different than in person. It has a different level of a mental load on you. A lot of reasons. One is you always stare at yourself, and when you stare at yourself, you're a little bit more critical, honestly, and so you're constantly balancing that. People's face sizes are different, so it kind of triggers, like, it feels like you're much closer to them than you are in normal conversation, which can sometimes like trigger like a feeling of like defensiveness. And then you're also just trying to track a lot. So when I'm talking to you in person, I'm just looking at you, even if I'm in a room full of people. But if I'm on a screen and there's 10 of us in this room, I can see all 10 people's faces at the same time, which is not how our brains are used to processing information when we're talking to someone. I'm physically moving, I'm seeing a portion of the room when I'm facing you, and I don't have to pay attention or process all of the other stuff, because our brains process way more than we are physically aware of. So when you're looking on the screen and you see 10 faces, your brain sees all 10 faces. You consciously are not aware that you're
processing 10 faces subconsciously, and you're
exactly
maxing out your information overload.
Yes, and so it's a lot. So your brain gets tired on Zoom because there's a lot more stimuli to be putting in place for a lot of different reasons. So that's one of the sciences behind it. But that's one of the reasons why you can't just take in-person practices and plug them into remote settings and then assume that if remote settings are not working, it's because they are remote settings. A lot of the times it's because when you switch to remote work, you actually are losing the ability for all the informal interactions that people call. They're like, they're not doing the coffee chats, they're not doing the run-bys, they're not doing all that stuff, and that's where the magic happens. The magic happens in those informal interactions in person because your structures and your processes were never actually all that good at communicating the information clearly in a way where everyone could access it in good time. And so we filled the gaps by these informal interactions, right? When you go to a meeting, how many times did you talk to a colleague and be like, I was really confused about X, Y, and Z? They clarify it for you, you're like, great. That's because it wasn't a very good meeting. Not because that informal interaction is actually the powerful thing, right, that made all the light bulbs go off. It was because you just didn't communicate that information in a way that everybody could understand it. And you fill in the gaps by these informal interactions, which you do not have remotely. It's much harder to have them. And so those communication breakdowns become bigger problems remotely, but the solution isn't just bring people back in the office so they can fill the holes with all the informal run-ins. The solution is teach people how to be better communicators using these tools and different ways in which we can communicate information more effectively and build this skill so that you are successful remotely And so that if you do choose that you want to go back to the office for hybrid, you will be even more successful when you are in person, because those same communication skills that make you successful remotely, you also need them when you are in person, because communication is everything that we do. Everything comes down to communicating information. So that's one of the main reasons that this happens a lot.
Give me a few examples of maybe some communication that isn't done correctly in a remote setting, or even like in an office setting that we should be fixing. So, an example, all right, so we're in the Zoom call, 10 different boxes going on. This is not optimal for our brain processing. What would something better look like?
Yeah, so...
Is there something better?
Yeah, so I like to talk about the example of like the ability that we have now for shared documents, now that we have cloud and all these sort of structures, all these different apps. Through a shared document, what a lot of the meetings used to be before we had these really good shared documents were, hey, I made a PowerPoint about a proposal for a project, right? I want to get in and I want to present it to you guys. Maybe I'll give it to you as a pre-read beforehand, but the whole purpose of the meeting is for us to have conversations around, do you like the project? Do you have any concerns? What risks do you see? All that sort of stuff. Is it approved? Can we move forward, right? That's basically a very frequent meeting most people had. Mm-hmm. With the advent of shared documents, you can still do that, but you can do it in a way that allows all voices to be in the room. Because when we used to do it in meetings, as you mentioned earlier in this call, right, the louder voices always predominated the meetings, because introverted voices don't really tend to want to speak up in those settings, and also just need time to process it more, and just usually are not ready to contribute their thoughts within the meeting, and then all of a sudden it's decided on, and then after the meeting they're like, crap, there's actually a huge risk for that, but it's too late, it's already got decided on. You're just not making really good processes when you're doing that. Shared documents create the ability, and this is all an asynchronous communication tool, right? You put your slide deck up there, you put it up, you tell people, hey, I want you guys to look at this as the project we're going to be proposing, put comments on about any questions that you may have or any concerns that you have with any of the information there for the next like couple days, say 3 days or something like that. Go in whenever you get a chance. We're going to go through it, and then I'll go back in as the owner for the project or whatever, the proposer, and I will answer any of the questions throughout, going on and on throughout these 3 days when I'm ready. There's no time period, just sometime throughout these days I'll be going in regularly and answering. And then in the end, if there's a lot of comments or a lot of questions, if there's a lot of things that we need to talk about, maybe I'll schedule a meeting for a decision. Or if everyone's really agreed on, it was just like a couple little suggestions, little tweaks, I'll do it, and then we can make a decision through various tools you can do virtually to make decisions. Nobody had to be in a meeting for that. You still got your decision made, and everyone got the opportunity to provide meaningful input, which means you probably were able to better surface risks that you wouldn't be able to surface if you used a meeting structure. And you were better able to have a document trail of all of that is currently in your system forever, for if somebody wants to come back to that project later and is like, oh, what was discussed, what concerns were there, all that sort of pieces, right? Which we are terrible at taking meeting notes, so that has never actually get documented very well. It is all there in this collective document that was your project proposal that got proposed, and you have all of it's there. And in that way, you are much more productive. Everyone gets to contribute. You get to make better decisions makings that way. Yeah, maybe it takes 3 days, but honestly, you probably had to wait a week anyways to get a meeting with all those people on the calendar anyway, so maybe it didn't delay your time at all. And you have a documented knowledge management tool for if things need to get revisited at any later date or someone's onboarding for the project. You have it all built in there without any extra work on anybody's time point, because the process created your document trail. And so that's just one really specific example of processes that need to be shifting and mindsets that need to shift for remote work to be really successful, in using an example that many of us have used. There's lots of different ways, but that's one good example.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing. It makes perfect sense to me. I am the introvert ilk, and I need time to process things in order to generate a decent response. I can't do on the fly very well. So these types of things, like if I could sit with it and look at it, contribute something, and then maybe talk about everything as it's been processed afterwards, I always find that to be a lot better. When I have meetings with my team, I'd say, hey, look, everybody do all these things, and we'll come together after you've pre-thought about everything, and then you can make decisions together. Like, let's bounce these things, as opposed to just free-form thinking, like, hey, everybody, let's force creativity into 30 minutes and nothing happens, and you've just wasted all this time. Yeah, no, that actually makes perfect sense to me. I wanted to think, okay, so this going away and having time to just process ideas as opposed to just cramming it into a meeting, reminds me of this. I don't know. Is it actually diffuse thinking? Maybe aspects of it are. Like, so you've got some creative project and people want to come together and come up with ideas for it. I imagine that is some form of maybe some focused and some diffuse. I don't know. I want, yeah, go ahead. I do want to explore this a little bit more because I don't feel like the way that we're currently set up allows for this diffuse thinking, these, the shower thoughts, these aha moments that we have. It almost feels like it's frowned upon to have these walking away minutes where you're walking around the block a few times and you're not sitting at your desk. And this is something that I've always encouraged with my teams over and over and over again. I'm like, go take a couple hours, go for a jog, go walk around the block, go meditate, go do something other than this, because these moments do come up. What is going on here? How are we missing this opportunity to encourage these types of moments so people can come to these meetings and say, hey, I had that aha moment?
Yeah, I think for me, I see that as an artifact of the push for efficiency that was a really big push for a while within organizations with Lean Six Sigma and stuff being applied in corporate settings, not just on factory floors, which is where it was developed. When you push for efficiency, we want to come in, have an hour meeting, brainstorm some stuff, and leave with an idea of what we want to be doing moving forward. That only can work if you prime it effectively. And to your point, the priming it effectively is giving people time to think in whatever way is best for them. We talked about all the options earlier. Think in whatever way is best for them. Focused attention on whatever the question is, whatever the problem you're trying to solve. Having focused attention on that to piece together all the different information, do whatever research, do whatever searches, look at whatever data, figure all that stuff out, and then take a series of breaks to just let it all do what it's going to do. And usually congeal, yeah. And so, and then after time, and this isn't all in one day sometimes this is multiple days depending on how complex the problem is, you can do series of coming together and talking about things, pausing, letting that coagulate and get together passively throughout your day, overnight, whatever you're doing in between times, and then coming back again to try to talk about and try to solidify things. So real creativity and innovation, even in collaborative settings where you want to bring people together and have conversations, always has an element of individual time that needs to happen. It looks very differently for extroverted people because to think I need to talk, like I need to literally, that's why I like podcasts, because I'm like, look.
Talk out loud, get your thoughts out.
I'm thinking while it's out there. That's why you're like, I might do quotes. I'm like, I don't know what I say half the time because I'm literally, it's coming up as I'm talking, right? So some people really do need that group time, which is why people really like to have those conversations. But then they still need that after time to really think about it and be like, oh, wait. Actually, I liked what this other person said. I liked what this thing said. I liked what I do. I want to research this one thing. And then you can get the ideas together and come back. So it's really about recognizing that our brain focuses, but the real power is behind all of the magical stuff that happens in our subconscious that needs time and space and free space to do. So it needs that diffuse thinking, which is literally like doing nothing that requires energy or focus. You need to create those breaks, and the more often you create those breaks throughout the day, the more insights you are likely to gather throughout the day. It's not guaranteed because sometimes, like I said, your brain gets tired. So sometimes your brain is literally taking a break. But even when it's taking a break and you feel like you're completely zoned out, it's still working. It's helping you breathe. It's helping you do all this sort of stuff. Your brain never stops. So taking breaks throughout the day is really where the power happens. So the one thing, if you take one thing away from this whole conversation around productivity, and whether you're in person or whether you're in the office, just let your people take breaks without any negative effects at all. And your work will be better because they were able to take breaks and they didn't feel like they were forced to be sitting, however you're measuring productivity, at all times. It will be better. It's just the way that the brain works. It needs breaks. The timing depends on the person, whether it's 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever. It depends on the person. But everyone's brain needs a break to be able to get the magic that we pay people for. We pay people for the magic of their brain doing brain things. And they need breaks to do that brain thing. So that's basically the essence of it.
I've said that to people before. Like, we are not paying people for hours worked. People never get that. Like, I used to do a lot of consulting. Say, well, how many hours do we get of you? I'm like, well, what do you get with hours? You don't get anything with hours. You're paying for a result. Like, you can pay me for a result, but my hours are of no consequence to you. It makes absolutely no sense to even think about it that way. Let's get nerdy. So what is actually happening in the brain when you're doing this diffuse thinking? When you're removing yourself from the situation and then you get an idea. Why is that happening? What is going on in there?
So there's a lot of theories about it. I don't remember the words off the top of my head because the reason I'm good at translating is because I honestly don't remember all of the detailed science on purpose. Basically, the back of your brain and different parts of your brain are making... So the way neurons work is they fire and they make different connections with each other. The way that you learn, there's a really great video out there, I don't remember the name of it, but basically neurons send a signal from one to the other. The more often that signal gets crossed from one to the other, it's just a little electrical current, the stronger that connection becomes. It's kind of like when you're building a bridge across a gully. It's basically the video, right? You put one string and then you put another string and then you put another string. All of a sudden there's a bridge and it's really easy to cross that. That's basically how your brain makes connections within the brain between different ideas. So all ideas that we have are a bunch of neurons connecting with each other, and in different parts of the brain we do different types of thinking. And basically what diffuse thinking does is when you are focused, different parts of your brain are activated, really focusing on the effort. But your memory and all that other stuff is usually stored in different parts of your brain. Memories for different things are stored in different parts of your brain. Your executive functions are in different places, and your emotions are in different places, all of which are relevant to us being able to make connections and think really critically. So when you aren't focusing your attention, putting all of your power and energy into this one part of your brain working, the rest of it can kind of then use that energy to be balancing across and then starting to move ideas, for lack of a better sense, from one to the other and build better connections. And so basically that's what when you take a break from focusing and putting all your energy into one place, you're letting your brain then do all of this background work because it has a certain amount of energy that it has, and it tends to prioritize one thing or another. Like if you image your brain, it's not all lit up all the time. One region's lit up at a time because it's just putting all its energy there, and the other one's kind of sleeping a little bit. And so when you take that energy and kind of let it go where it needs to go, that's when it can start to make the connections between different parts of your brain to make it as simple as humanly possible without telling you a bunch of gyruses and cingulates and cortex and all that stuff. It's basically just a bunch of neurons talking, and it needs the time and space for the energy to move around the brain so it can make different connections and then strengthen those connections so they happen habitually and they happen easier. So that's basically what's happening in the end.
I would argue that in most situations it's probably easier to do that when you're working remote because it's just, again, it's frowned upon to be zoning off at your desk. People want to see hands on keyboards. However, I've been seeing a lot of arguments online because I'm constantly arguing against RTO, return to office. Yeah. And people are trying to make the case to me very strongly on behalf of people working remote that this type of work is making people lonely and it's ruining their mental health. I'm seeing this all the time. I don't know if it's actually coming from a genuine place when people are saying this type of thing. I think they just like being in an office and they're trying to make an argument against it. But they are saying that this is a problem and that people are getting too lonely and you need to go into an office in order to get your socialization in to be a healthy individual. Is there any truth to this? And if there is truth to this, what do we do as remote workers in order to make sure that this isn't a problem?
So this one's really complex, and it's something that I've been teasing on a lot with myself and then also looking through and thinking about the literature and the history on it. So yes, if we spend most of our time, or a big chunk of our time, at work with the same group of people, we naturally were going to be building connections and relationships with them because we're social creatures. Whoever we spend a lot of time with, we build relationships with because that's how you survived back in the day. So yeah, when we are in person, we had work families, work friendships, work things, and work relationships that were really helpful. There's also a lot of research that shows if you are connected with the people that you work with, you do better work because part of our motivation is to live up to the expectations of our social community. And if your social community is part of where you work, then part of what is motivating you to do better work is that connections that you have with the people you work from. So I will say that is true in the sense of a lot of things. Also, the more connected you are with people in your job, the more happy you are, the more psychological safety you can have, and then the better productivity, even though I don't like to say productivity, the more productive you are as a person. I think the challenge for me when we talk about it is, yes, when you're remote, by definition, you probably are leaving your house less, so you are interacting with people outside of your immediate family who lives with you less. I think that's obvious. And that increases a lot of loneliness because there are a lot of people who then don't interact with anybody if they are working from home. And building relationships through a screen is very different than building relationships through a computer in person, because those informal interactions are where a lot of the relationships happened, right? And it's hard. Like putting a coffee chat on someone's calendar feels very different than walking up to them in a room. That's true. So there is truth in that you are less connected to your colleagues when you're working remotely because of this. My question, though, in relation to the solution for that and the solution to loneliness overall is as a broader conversation about just because we were at work and we got most of our community and societal connections through work, is that really where we should have been getting all of our community and societal connections? Or should we have actually been connecting more with our community around us in a way that is outside of work? So that your work isn't the same where you get your money, where you get your social interaction, where you get all your training. Because most of our training after we leave school is actually through our work as well. Work was serving a lot of purposes back in the day, but does it have to be the thing that is serving that purposes? And then what's the impact to loneliness if I actually I use the time I didn't spend commuting, the 2 hours a day, right? Most people who spent commuting, and I actually get to hang out with my neighbor instead around the corner because I am not commuting every day, and then I build much stronger community relationships with the people who are actually close to me. What would the power of that be for then our emotional and mental well-being, which then translates into better work? I don't think we've really explored that well, but there is data that isn't always cited in the same breath as remote work data that also says that we are less connected to our community as well. And that has been a trend for a very long time. That is way before COVID, where the trend has been starting, where we are more and more disconnected with the people around us, where neighbors don't really know neighbors, where you don't really talk to people that you live near. We don't really talk to strangers that much as we used to, right? The whole concept of stranger danger that was ingrained in a lot of us as kids is still there as adults, and it is creating more of a disconnection. So my question is less about where should you be getting it and where is the skill gap, and then whose responsibility is it to create the spaces and opportunities and to teach the skills for how to be social and how to talk to strangers and stuff like that. There's a couple companies that are exploring this, but that's one of the big questions that I have about the assumptions when we talk about remote work, right? Just because we always did do it in the office, is that what we want to be doing in the future? And is that a good enough reason to be returning to the office? I mean, I don't know the answer to that from a loneliness thing, because loneliness is a really big problem. So maybe it's worth it if it actually significantly decreases our loneliness. But I think it's just an assumption that the only way to do that is by returning to the office versus some other potential avenues that we haven't even bothered exploring in any real way yet.
Right, so there's a lot of things that go into this loneliness problem, and this is just an easy one to point a finger at. Well, people aren't leaving their house, they're getting delivery, got to fix that, right? But just saying that going into an office and interacting with people that you might not even get along with, they might not be the people that you choose to get along with, is the answer to socialization kind of doesn't make sense, because it may not be a one-size-fits-all for people. I will say, though, people that go remote initially, I've seen people crash out pretty hard. And usually what happens is they forget that they are not getting the interaction that they're needing. They're sitting in the house and working, and then they're like, okay, I've now worked more hours than I'm used to working, and now I'm too tired to go out and do stuff. And they're not actually proactively saying, I'm going to go out and play the sport. I'm going to go hike with some friends. And they just kind of forget that that's built into their normal day. And now that it's not built in, they're not going the extra steps to doing that. So I remember finding that out for myself when I first went remote. I'm like, my God, I am lonely. I didn't realize I'm not doing well. So it takes a few extra steps to get there. But yeah, I agree. I don't know that this is just a go back into the office and we fix the whole loneliness epidemic. I don't think that's probably the whole thing.
I also think that there's a holdover to the pandemic. So during the pandemic, right, for a long period of time, we got used to not interacting with other people. We got used to not leaving our house. We got used to being scared of other people for the most part, right? Mm-hmm. That then became a habit because that happened long enough for it to become a habit to be by yourself and to avoid other people, basically, besides your pause, besides whatever.
That was long enough to be a habit?
Well, it was like a year for a lot of people, or even 6 or 7 months for others. If 24/7 for 6 or 7 months,
especially for younger people. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're forming your brain. So I always wonder, and I know there's been some initial research into this, but obviously we need a longer tail to really tease it out. But like, I think that really did impact all of our social skills. Like, even from my perspective, I remember when we first started being able to go out, I'm a very social person, and it was hard. It was so hard to just, just like, the first time you're in like a social setting, you're like, do I shake hands? Do I hug? I forgot even how to like greet a stranger. That's where the fist bump came in. It's like, and you're just like, what do I say? Like, it's hard. And so I really wonder how much of this is actually a holdover of that, where maybe, especially in some companies and for some people, they never went back to the office even for a little bit after COVID. How much of this is a holdover of those habits that we developed that haven't had a forcing function to change them? And so like when you return to office, it's a forcing function because your job and your livelihood is being forced to then go and do something. So that's why sometimes I'm like, when we see this data and we see this uptick and we see these changes in some of this stuff, I'm not sure how much it's causal versus how much it's just like, if that's the only forcing function for you to leave your house, of course you're probably going to have an increase in positive feelings and emotional feelings. But if you had another forcing function to leave your house and go to a library, would you have had the same effect? My guess would be yes. So like, that's one of the things where I sometimes question some of the data we have around this, because there's just a lot of assumptions in it, depending on what's the pre and post conditions that you're looking at, and then what you naturally would just assume. So and of course, if you want people to return to the office, you're going to use this data and be like, see, returning to the office is magical and it has great societal benefit for everybody. And you're like, okay, maybe, but like, I have questions.
Yeah, right. I've got questions. All right, I want to talk about one more topic, maybe one and a half more topics. Okay, so what are your thoughts on hustle culture? Because I thought it was starting to go away. You know, these people, I wake up at 3:30 a.m., I chant affirmations while taking an ice plunge, and then I've started 3 businesses by 6 a.m. I thought this thing was kind of going away, but I'm still seeing it on a podcast. I still saw a story come out the other day that was encouraging the 996 culture, and that's 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, saying you got to grind if you want to make it in this life. Meanwhile, you've got contrasting data that says every hour worked over 48 hours a week takes like 2.5 years off your life. Where are you at on this, as long as we're talking about employee productivity and sustainability and all that kind of stuff? How are you feeling about when you see these kind of headlines?
It might help you in the short term, but it's going to burn you in the long term, both from an individual perspective and a company perspective. It is not sustainable.
Flat out, just that. Okay.
Yeah, period. We cannot do that. Hustle culture in general is driven out of need, I think, is one of the most important things. There are a handful of people in the world that choose to hustle, right? Those are the founders, the people who really are creating something. Sometimes the people in startups who actually own big portions of the equity that are choosing to do it because they're going to get actual benefit from it in the long run. And okay, fine, everyone can choose your own thing. That's just a personal choice. The challenge that I have is when they are forced functions, right? Where it's forced either because as an employee, you are being forced to work a 9-9-6 schedule, whether it's legal or illegal, although it's illegal in almost every instance.
Guilt-based.
And or hustle culture where you need to be doing multiple jobs in addition to your actual job, which is another implementation of hustle culture, right? So that you have enough money to live. Both of those are forced conditions. Those will drain you, and they will drain you in the long run and in the short term. Mentally, you cannot work that much focused, and so you make poor decision making. You tend to be in more stress cycles, and you're just not being as good of a worker in any of your jobs. The second long-term thing is a long-term stress of putting too much time and effort and requirements onto your physical body as well as your mental state. And we all know the long-term effect of chronic stress. I think it's been talked about a lot. You're basically putting yourself into a chronic stress state, and you're going to get all of those effects of it. You're going to burn out eventually, however long that tail is depends. The only time that you can actually work this hard, and that's why I pulled the founders and people who are choosing to out, is if you choose to do this and you choose to grind, your brain kind of has a powerful mechanism where if it's a conscious choice that you want to and you see the benefit of it and it is self-motivated, you can maintain longer activities and longer things than most normal people. Still trying to figure out exactly why that is, but it is a protective effect. It doesn't have the same negative effect, probably because it produces less stress, because probably you're not feeling like you're forced to do it. You're feeling like you want to do it. So there's more reward things happening in your brain in response to it because it's a choice and you want to. You get a lot more dopamine hits than cortisol stressors. So that's basically, it's just bad. So like if you are choosing to, fine. If you are forced to, it's just bad because you're just stressing yourself out. And so companies need to recognize the difference there.
Is it actually true, even if you are choosing to? I mean, I know so many people that are putting in all these hours because I love my work, I'm attached to my work. Does your body know the difference when you're sitting in front of a laptop for 70 hours? I mean, you still are adding stress to your body. It might feel a little better, but
it insulates you. I didn't say it protects you from all of it, but it does insulate you. Fair. So like your tear will probably be much longer and the impacts probably will be less than someone who doesn't have a choice, but it still impacts you because if you're forcing yourself, your brain, I mean, it's your brain is a muscle. So the easiest way to conceptualize this concept, right, is like if you just were trying to do like work your bicep out all the time for 20 hours a day, like eventually you're just doing damage, right? Like you can do it, but you're still doing damage because you're forcing yourself beyond the point where you can do it in a sustainable fashion. What that point is of where you're forcing it for your brain is impacted by your choice because, like I said, the amount of reward triggers versus dopamine versus stress triggers are different if you're choosing to, but that doesn't impact the amount of energy available to you, right? So you need sleep to be able to replenish things within your brain. You need food, you need all these other things to replenish your energy levels and the basic building blocks that allows you to do this thinking. And a lot of the times when people grind too long, you're losing all of that. Your sleep is compromised, you're not eating as well, you're not eating as healthily, and you're just draining your energies and then running on fumes. Our bodies can do it. Our bodies like to live. But are you doing long-term harm? Yes. Are you having much worse decision-making than you are consciously aware of? Yes. Which is one of the negatives of these 996 things in general, is because you feel like you're doing more and being more productive, but most likely your decision-making and your critical thinking is not as good as you think it is. But you're in it, and so you're not a good judge. And if everybody else in the company is in it, nobody is a good judge at a certain point in time, and that's where it becomes really
drunkenly making decisions all over the place.
And that's why it becomes really risky for these companies that are doing it in the long term.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, so to wrap things up, you said every broken system in your organization exists because someone was too comfortable to question it. Okay, so unpack that a little bit for me, I guess this would be mostly for business owners, executives, also, maybe what it means to employees too, because it's super relevant to them. So with that in mind, if nobody's questioning things, what would you say to them as an incentive to maybe rethink the way that they're looking at work and their employees?
Yeah, to put it bluntly and more negatively than I tend to like
Go
to,
ahead.
it's adapt or die, right? So especially in the world that we're in now, where our larger everything about what we are living in is going to be changing at an incredibly rapid pace. There are some people saying that it's actually going to be changing at an exponential pace, which is way faster than we can't conceptualize exponential growth. So with that in mind, thinking back and staying and just doing things how we have always done it seems safe, but is inherently risky because the environment around us is changing. And so even what worked yesterday is not promised to be working tomorrow. So one thing that I say is, while it feels safe, it is a risk that you just don't realize is a risk. So if that's true, why don't we question what we have been doing when we are starting to feel friction and tension? So when what we are doing feels friction and tension for whatever reason, and somebody notices it, why don't we spend time really thinking about it, looking into it, and seeing if we need to do something different? Whether it's actually changing that process, whether it's changing something around the process that is creating friction, but recognizing the data and the feedback that we get and being open to adjust and experiment with stuff as we go, to be constantly making changes. And that is the only way that we are going to be able to be subsisting in this future where everything is constantly going to be changing. And if we don't build this adaptive mindset, it is just going to lead all of us to be frozen in place and then we'll just be left there while everyone rushes ahead of us and tramples on top of us because it's just stuck there. Or we'll be frozen in place like the frogs, right? When they get put into a boiling water, the crabs, I guess, is a more well-known one. Where you get put into boiling water and you're trying to adjust, and then you're dead, right? Because you refuse to change. Yeah, so it's really important to keep that in mind, especially as we think about the pace of the changing world around us is not going to slow down. It's only going to speed up. So if you don't figure out how to really look at things and embrace them, then you're taking a risk by making that choice. It is not the safe choice anymore.
You're saying that a lot with some of these RTO companies that are enforcing these mandates, and then employees are quitting and they're getting poached by other companies. They're just not adapting.
Good employees are quitting. What I don't understand
it's the good employees, right?
Yeah. Yes. RTO mandates are the most... That's why I'm like, you're literally seeing fear responses of people's brains in action. And it is fascinating from my perspective, but really sad from another perspective, because all of these things that people are doing to cut headcounts, to do all of this sort of stuff, which we all know there are ways to lay off without laying off, all this sort of stuff. They are not the ways in which you cut the waste within your organization. So all of them are like, I need to lay off, I need to cut people, I need to do whatever. The people who will leave in those situations are the people who have other options and or are confident enough in their ability to weather the change, are confident enough in their ability to adapt, are the smart people who are pretty sure they're going to be able to find another job. The ones who are going to move their entire life to go work for you in a different state are maybe they're ones that really believe in your mission, but considering companies don't really give that much back to people, it's probably not that. They are probably the people who are less likely to adapt, who let fear of change rule their world and will do everything to stay in a place that feels safe and comfortable. And those are not necessarily the people that you want to be filling your organizations moving forward. Not to say that those aren't good people. I think people who have a fear response to change and push us to be more cautious are really important to balance out people who will just blow everything up every time something changes. They're really important parts of teams. But if that is the only, your whole teams are made up of people with that sort of a mindset, then you are creating a situation where you might be more beholden to, well, that's how we've always done it, where you might be working more from a protective place versus like a play to win place. So like, it's just something to be thinking about that I think is very short-minded for all of these sorts of things. I think it is giving the effects they want in the short term, but in the long term, this is going to bite a lot of those companies in the butt because they are not making decisions from a calm and logical place. They're making decisions from an emotional, fear-based place, and they're not aware of it because they are currently in that emotional, fear-based trigger process within their brains. And so like, that's why I think the work is really important to help us all learn how to be more self-aware of when we're in these places so that we can maybe not act out of these instinctual fears and try to introduce a little bit more long-term thinking and strategic planning, even when we're in these places where everything's changing and it's very scary for us.
Are they too big to mess up? I mean, somebody argued with me the other day saying, well, I think it was JP Morgan Chase. That was a big one because Jamie Dimon had all those things to say. Basically, everybody can go fuck off. I'm doing it my way kind of thing. And somebody was telling me, well, I'm sure they've ran all the data on it. You think they'd make a decision this big without verifying it? And I was arguing, well, I think they are big enough to be able to afford screwing this up, right? Like, I don't think they're going to feel it as quickly as a 60-person company. If something goes wrong with a 60-person company, it's going to go down immediately, whereas these big companies can afford to screw up something this big. So I was saying, actually, I think the inverse is true in that the big companies will make these giant mistakes because they can absorb it a little bit more. Or am I wrong?
No, I mean, I think that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, like, I think...
Okay.
From a larger... No.
Yeah.
But I'll comment because I think it's an important piece. Like, what's interesting in the data is that there are a smaller portion of large companies who are doing RTO, but the majority of middle and small companies are not. So it's kind of a large amount of big, powerful voices that are making these changes, but it's not actually the majority of companies. At least the last time I checked the data. Obviously, this stuff has been changing a lot recently. But so I think it's also really important to be keeping in mind in terms of who's doing what. To your point about, is it worth the risk? Bigger organizations, to your point, can do more risky things and then figure it out and make it work in the long run because they have just much more buffers than what they are. And if in the end they need to, they can just cut half of their thing and then have that money for profit to do something else, right? They have massive amounts of money to be playing with, and they have proven that they don't care about their people and the ability to not be risky for their people's livelihood and longevity. So yeah, I think you see these big companies taking some of these big risks for reasons that we probably aren't fully aware of, probably to make examples of doing even, to make it possible for them to do even bigger, crazier, risky things to try to adapt to things in the future. So I think a lot of it is about seeing them and recognizing that they might not be the model you should be following, I think is the really important message that you were kind of getting at, right? Like, just because a big organization who you feel like has more data than you is making this decision, that does not necessarily mean it's the right decision for you, because it's going to be more risky. Your risk calculations are very different than someone who makes hundreds of billions of dollars or like even trillions of dollars in their market cap, right? So like, you just can't be playing in the same playing field as them, and don't assume that the data that they are using is using the same criteria that you would be using for yourself. And I think that's one of the really important things when we are seeing more people have conversations about RTO, when they're like, all these big firms are doing it. Like, what am I missing? Should I be doing it too? Do they see something that I don't because of the big players in the pond? It's like, maybe, but whatever opportunities they see are probably not opportunities that you will be as easily able to go after as them. So do you really want to be playing in the same pool as them, following along, if you don't even see where you're going with making these decisions, especially when there's a lot of data to show that this is a risky decision to be doing?
I was reading a lot about that. People were saying, well, everyone's just waiting for the first domino to fall, and they're gonna see what, Dell did it, and that was an early one, and they're just like, okay, we want to do it. We want to do RTO mandates. We want some of the big players to do it first. But to your point, we have to really think about, do we want to lump ourselves in with them, and why are they doing these things? You saw, again, using Jamie Dimon as an example, him saying we work better in person. Just all these very vibey, non-metrics based types of things, just values based types of statements, and then brings everybody back into the office, and then just a few weeks ago announces, I'm planning to have the majority of the company run on AI, like just right after that. So I mean, like, how much sincerity is there in these kind of things? So if you are working at a big organization, really take these things into consideration, because it may not actually be in your benefit. Well, I would say probably pointed towards a smaller to mid-sized organizations. I wouldn't use these as the model, because you're seeing a lot of this happen, and then they want to go to AI, and then Starbucks announces 30,000 people or Amazon, 30,000 people getting cut following an RTO mandate. Starbucks, but X number of people getting cut after an RTO mandate. This might not be, where you want to be putting your thoughts, because you don't know what's going on internally with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that they used RTO mandates to try to cut their workforce. They probably didn't cut it as much as they thought they were going to do, but then they have to pay less severance for people who if they lay off less people, there's less severance that they have to pay, because the people who left voluntarily because they didn't want to do return to office, they didn't have to pay severance for. And then they, instead of firing 100,000 people, they fired 30,000 people. Like, well, I don't know the numbers. Well, and then they were going to replace all of them by AI anyways, right? And so, like, everybody's, it's like these, but we don't know what they are. But that's my point in terms of these people are so big, and they are working with concepts that you aren't going to understand. So if you don't understand what they are doing, and it feels like we are making things up, or it feels like you are guessing, then you are not making good decisions based on that data. So use the data that you have available to make the best decisions that you can make for your company, within your context, within what you are doing, instead of following what other people are doing, because you probably don't know the 3 or 4 steps ahead that they are thinking. And they are thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead. But these companies also have the capital to be able to potentially actually implement AI in a way that might be able to replace some of these workers. Do you have that amount of capital? Because right now it is very expensive to play around with AI at a scale of replacing this number of people. They have the capital. Do you? And so that's one of the questions of, like, blindly following people into this space where there's so much uncertainty, when you don't even know what their calculations are, where you will be left holding the bag because you did RTO, a bunch of your people quit, you can't replace them with AI, so now you have to hire them all back, and you have all this like sort of issues, and
they're more expensive, and exactly.
So until you know what data you are playing with and making informed decisions for yourself, then you are just acting in a reactive place, and any leader acting from a reactive place is probably not making the best decisions for their company.
Sasha, this has been an awesome conversation. I could do this for an entire separate podcast. This is a lot of fun for me. Thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so if you want to hear about my work, mostly it's on LinkedIn. I focus most of my time there. Sasha Farley. I have a website that has a lot of stuff about what I believe and the different stuff that I offer, sashafarleyconsulting.com. And yeah, follow me there and reach out and chat with me. I love talking with people, so happy to connect.
Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week.